So you all have heard that, okay, that might be pretty good, but why do we have to inject into the corner pocket? Because we all might have heard that part of the injection at least has to be done in this corner. And this was always something that, way before imaging was used, was something in my mind. I will, have my sessions with Dr. Winnie and see if he could tell me why we had to inject the supraclavicular block at the time done with a nerve stimulator with a specific contraction of the fingers that actually predicted a pretty good success. But if instead you got a shoulder contraction, or you got a biceps, or you got a pectoralis, the result was not as good. And Dr. Winnie will tell me a wonderful story of him meeting somebody. So I knew that when he was avoiding the question is because he didn't know the answer. So we just didn't know the answer. But the most common answer, because it's just so intuitive, is to believe that they're septi. So there are septums here that prevent the free diffusion of the local anesthetic into what I'm calling now a compartment, and at the time was called the sheath. So I did a study back, I think it was 2006, where I injected in front of with a twitch that was signaling that the tip of the needle was in the upper trunk, and then in the middle trunk, and then in the lower trunk. And what I found was that if I injected either in front of the upper or the middle trunk, then there was a failure to produce anesthesia in the lower trunk by about 40% of the time. However, if I injected in front of the lower trunk, and this was one single injection in one single point, I got anesthesia of every place, every trunk. So then I realized that a septum here could not explain it, because that would have to be impermeable to local anesthetic going down, but permeable going up. And obviously there is no tissue that will exhibit that kind of selectivity. So that was not the reason. But unfortunately, people still think mechanistically that those are sufficient reasons. There's septi that prevent your success, although you don't take into account that when you're on the other side, then there's no problem for that local to pass through that septum. So I knew that that was not the reason. So I wrote that the injection of local anesthetic close to the lower trunk increases the chances of blocking it directly, overcoming the obstacle to diffusion that the closely located pulsatile artery might exert on this trunk. This remains speculative. I wrote that was in 2004. Today, this is considered to be the reason why we don't get a good spread of the local anesthetic unless we inject in the proximity of the subclavian artery. So obviously you will find people that will still believe in artificial septums and things, but the pulsation of the subclavian artery will produce an area close to that edge, to that corner of higher resistance. So the local that was injected more proximally will have trouble advancing toward that corner. And in that corner is where the anterior division of the lower trunk is located. So notice that that will be a failure more than just the ulnar nerve, will be the failure of the C81 dermatome, meaning that you will have a failure in the entire medial side of the arm, including the fingers, the wrist, the forearm, the elbow. So it's not a failure that is a minor failure. It's not an ulnar nerve failure. It's an ulnar nerve plus medial brachial cutaneous nerve and medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve. So it's a failure of the C81 dermatome. So you see how interesting things can be done just by thinking, because obviously I didn't have the practical means to determine that this was the reason. And usually working with cadavers, the arteries usually don't pulsate. So, so you have to think a little bit ahead. and you can get answers to some of the questions that we have. Now, the need to bring the needle this close to the first rib produces a safety issue. And I cannot really overemphasize this. This is the problem with the supraclavicular. You still see people getting pneumothorax in the era of ultrasound. And it shouldn't be. But it's unfortunate that it is. So I have never got a pneumothorax in my entire practice. And I not only count my personal, all the blocks that have been done under my supervision, demonstrating that it's possible not to get into pneumothorax if you really, when we did it, what is called now blindly, it was not completely blind. We were reading things by navigating using a nerve stimulator. But we did a number of blocks, and we never got into that. This is, for instance, a publication of 2020 blocks that I did in 2006. So not a small publications, but in the beginning of my career, I was always determined to publish large numbers, because the most frequent criticism was, oh, the nerve stimulator hasn't shown to be better than a landmark technique. So there is no large study. So the first study that I published with supraclavicular was 1,001 blocks. And then, eventually this 2020 in the obese population with good success. So now, how do you deal with the problem of pneumothorax? And let's just go quickly over this. I painted the pleura yellow there. This is my own CT scan I did for other reasons. And here is the pleura. So notice how the pleura, the dome of the pleura, is surrounded by the first rib. And unfortunately, the first rib is rounded. Because if we had square first ribs, then it wouldn't matter anterior, posterior, where you are landing on that rib, the same amount of needle will always hit the same amount of rib, whether you are anterior or posterior. But if the rib is rounded, then you have a problem, because if you are more anterior, you're closer to the clavicle, then the rib is coming in, protecting more pleura. But if you are a little bit more back, you see how the pleura becomes increasingly bigger. So making possible that the same amount of needle that let you land safely on the first rib could actually, if drifted behind the image you're seeing, it could actually land on the pleura. And you will not just recognize it, you're just not seeing, you're seeing another image. So obviously, the easiest solution for that problem would be to always have a visual contact with the needle. But we all know that that's not possible. The needle appears, and we kind of throw a party for it, and then the needle disappears, for a whole time. 20 seconds, the needle is still, and you see movement in the image, transmitted movement, but you don't see the actual needle. And unfortunately, people take that as being the needle. Then all of a sudden, the needle appears and kind of surprises you that's in a position that you didn't think it was, judging just by the movement of the image. So you know that you cannot trust that you will continue to have contact with the needle at all times. So you have to come with another solution. And this occupied my mind for a while because I wanted to come with some type of solution that would be easy to implement. So I have come with a solution, and I'm not saying it's the only solution, but it's a very practical solution. And I teach it to everybody that goes through our rotation, and that would be establishing a margin of safety, as I will call it. And it's simply having an image of the first rib that overshoots the subclavian artery medially. It's as simple as that. So you will put the medial edge of the rib. So notice that this is the edge that looks at the pleura. This is the edge that looks at the first intercostal space. So what you will have as a working image would be an edge, the pleural edge of the first rib located medial to the artery. So you will not have a first rib that is starting there and then extending lateral. It looks exactly the same. It looks as safe. Both look similar. But notice that in 3 dimensions, this edge is going to start receding toward you. Now, by putting it so far from your point of injection, you guarantee that if your needle drifted back, you will still be in solid ground. You still will be on the first rib. However, if you started with an image, so you see the rib will recede toward you, but you still would be very far from the edge, not in danger of falling over the edge. However, if you started with a rib, and I should have an actual image of that, but anyhow, if you imagine the rib is, instead of starting there, starting here and then extending lateral, notice that it looks solid, it looks the same, looks like you will drive the needle toward the same rib, and it won't make a difference. But it does, because this rib will recede toward you, so if your needle just drifted a little bit back, it could be in the pleura without you noticing, because you will be seeing an image that is more anterior. And you will see the movement on the image, and you will be thinking that you're perfectly fine. And then, the patient might decide to cough or take a deep breath and do all the things that patients do while you're doing blocks. And then, you might not even need to make an effort to produce a pneumothorax. The patient might bring the pleura to your needle for, great service. So keep that in mind, that an easy maneuver, which produces an image that has the rib starting medial to the artery, solves the problem in practical way. Now, I have managed to convince half of the audience, when I give these talks in the operating room, the residents are, drifting and fantasizing, and then all of a sudden they come back to me and they kind of agree. That sounds like okay. But then, when we go into the field and we drive the needle, then they work as bureaucrats. So they produce this image, and then they check it. And then when they bring the needle, this next step is disconnected to this. So now, the only thing that matters to them is to see the needle. So when they find the needle, then they can't understand why I'm having a nerve breakdown. Because they say, what else do you want? There is the needle. And indeed is the needle. But now the needle is not in this image. And notice that this image, a flat image, as much as the pages of a book are flat images and parallel to each other. So when you were reading an old-fashioned book with a book marker, and you dropped the book and the marker went away, and the Good Samaritan came and put the marker whatever, although the position of the marker is parallel to where you were, is not in the right page, most likely. So this is the same concept, that here, when the needle comes into action, it has to be in this image. So they are not disconnected, they're not different processes. These are steps in one single process. So you get this image, and then you bring the needle to this image, not to the other one that is behind or in front, but to this image. So you have a very narrow window of opportunity in the supraclavicular block. And that is one of the main drawbacks of this block. So you have a narrow window. If you are unable to drive a needle to this flat image, then you should think about doing some other technique, not necessarily this one. So the needle has to be brought to this image in order to accomplish the safety margin and the safety margin working for you. Well, the injection, as you know, could be done entirely there in that corner. But in the area of ultrasound would be a disservice to the image if you just waited and hold it until you got there, since you can dissect, you can hydrodissect your way into where you want to go, and in the process you are using some of the local anesthetic, making your life easier, moving nerves away from the tip of the needle, and eventually keeping in mind that part of that volume, which, you know, we used to inject 40, but the new 40 is 20, that part of that volume will go into that corner, and that you will not rest until local anesthetic occupies a corner instead of a nerve occupying that corner. That is the success of the supraclavicular block. Now you know that you can sign that chart and go for your coffee, because that block is going to work. That block is going to work. So, and it is just as simple as that. And then you can do it in all sorts of patients. This patient, you can see how swollen his lips are. He has been beaten, and you know, he got a wonderful supraclavicular block for whatever other problem he had.